In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how some people are unhappy because of their situations in life.
One of the criticisms I have of the psychoanalysts and the clinicians in general, even though I have great admiration for them and would say that what they have to say is very much worth listening to, is that it's not obvious that your personality is inside you. You know, you think, a human being is a strange multi-level thing. And you might ask yourself, well, for example, is your mother more a part of you than your arm? Or maybe even more precisely, is your child more a part of you than your arm? I mean, certainly people will do drastically self-sacrificing things to maintain the lives of their children. And so you're a person, and you're made out of all sort of subcomponents of a person, none of which you can see when you look at a person, all the complicated machinery inside you that makes you who you are. And then outside of that, of course, you're nested in all sorts of complex systems. So you're part of a family, and you're part of a community, and that's part of a province, and that's part of a state, and that's part of an international consortium of states, and that's part of an ecosystem. And how you make a distinction between you and the systems that you're embedded in is also of extraordinary difficulty. And one of the things that you have to do as a clinical psychologist, for example, if you're trying to diagnose someone with depression, you think, well, this person's dreadfully unhappy. Well, you can think about that as a problem with their psychological adjustment, the way that they're looking at the world. But if you look at the epidemiological literature, for example, one of the things that you find is that very many people have a first depressive episode after something genuinely terrible has happened to them, right? They've lost someone, or they've become injured, or they've become unemployed, because unemployment is a terrible shock to people. And it's not precisely self-evident that you can consider someone who's unhappy and desperate because they no longer have a job depressed. They're certainly sad and they're not doing very well, but the fact that they no longer have an income is actually something with dramatic practical consequences, and treating that as if it's a mental disorder seems to be counterproductive. It's also the case, for example, that if someone comes into you to talk to you and they're very upset, and they may manifest the signs of, say, an anxiety disorder, or again depression, or other clinical features for that matter, you have to do a careful analysis of their manner in which they're embedded in their family, because, and this is something that we'll talk about quite thoroughly when we come to discussing Freud, is that, well, it's not like everybody's families are necessarily particularly happy places to be. I mean, human beings are very dependent. We have a very long period of dependency, partly because we're so cortically hyper-developed. It takes a very long time to program us into something that's vaguely capable of maneuvering on its own, and that produces, of course, the very tight familial bonds that we all desperately require, because who wants to be alone in the world? But it also exposes us to the probability of becoming entangled into even multi-generational family pathology. And it isn't obvious always, and it certainly hasn't been to me when I've seen my clients, that the fundamental problem with the client is the client. Sometimes the fundamental problem is the family. And perhaps that person has been identified as the problem person. It's rather convenient for everyone who's involved to make that presupposition. It's also the case that this is the Freudian idea fundamentally, this is the Oedipal idea, that it's very easy for people to become over-dependent on their parents, and for the parents to facilitate that, and then for the primary developmental problem for the individual, in fact, to become free of the interfering elements of the family so that they can exist as independent individuals. Well, and then of course there are cultural variations in that make that proposition complex, but that's a fundamental tenet, say, of Freudian psychology. A lot of the clinical psychologists, all of whom that we're going to study, have a pronounced Western orientation. One of the fundamental presuppositions is that part of the hallmark of positive psychological development is the creation of an individual that's capable of acting independently. And that's, I would say, an implicit ideal that lurks at the bottom of the clinical presuppositions of all the theorists that are classic psychologists.
Thanks for watching.